What's up everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving deep into something that's been on my mind ever since HBO announced A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, the upcoming adaptation of George R.R. Martin's beloved Dunk and Egg novellas. If you're a fan of Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon, you might be expecting more of the same, more massive battles, more shocking deaths, more political scheming on a grand scale. But here's the thing, Tales of Dunk and Egg is something fundamentally different, and I mean really different. George R.R. Martin himself has said these stories have a much different tone from what we've seen before, even though they're set in the same world of Westeros. So today, we're going to explore exactly what makes these stories so distinct, why the shift in tone matters, and what it means for the future of the franchise. Let's get into it. Before we compare the tones, let's establish what we're actually talking about here. Game of Thrones, based on A Song of Ice and Fire, needs no introduction. It's a sprawling epic that took over television for nearly a decade, featuring multiple storylines across an entire continent, dozens of major characters, and conflicts that literally threaten the existence of humanity. House of the Dragon continues in that tradition, focusing on the Dance of the Dragons, a civil war that tore House Targaryen apart with dragonfire and bloodshed. These are stories about the fate of kingdoms, about who sits on the Iron Throne, about power struggles that cost thousands of lives. Meanwhile, Tales of Dunk and Egg, set about 90 years before the events of Game of Thrones, takes us back to a quieter time in Westerosi history. These are 3 published novellas, The Hedge Knight, The Sworn Sword, and The Mystery Knight, that follow a lowborn hedge knight named Ser Duncan the Tall and his young squire Egg, who happens to be secretly Prince Aegon Targaryen. But unlike the grand narratives we're used to, these stories aren't about conquering kingdoms or preventing apocalypses. They're about a big, somewhat naive knight trying to do the right thing in a complicated world, one small choice at a time. So let's talk about scale, because this is where the difference becomes immediately obvious. Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon are what you might call macro-level stories. They're concerned with the big picture, the movements of armies, the machinations of great houses, the consequences that ripple across entire continents. When characters die in Game of Thrones, it often triggers wars. When decisions are made, they affect thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people. The Red Wedding doesn't just kill Robb Stark, it effectively ends the Northern Rebellion and reshapes the political landscape of Westeros. The destruction of the Great Sept of Baelor eliminates multiple major players in a single moment and sets Daenerys' invasion in motion. Everything is consequential on a massive scale. Tales of Dunk and Egg operates on what we might call a micro level. These stories are intimate, personal, focused on the day-to-day realities of 2 individuals wandering the 7 kingdoms. Yes, there are tournaments and trials by combat, but they're not deciding the fate of nations. They're resolving personal disputes, matters of honor, local conflicts between minor lords. The stakes feel immediate and human rather than epic and world-changing. As George R.R. Martin himself described it, the series will be smaller in scale, more personal, with more humor, more focus on character. It's not a story about conquering armies or fire-breathing monsters, even though dragons existed in recent memory. It's about small choices, loyalty, and the struggle for dignity. This brings us to character perspective, which fundamentally shapes how we experience these worlds. Game of Thrones employs multiple point-of-view characters, constantly shifting between different locations and storylines. One moment, you're in King's Landing watching Cersei scheme. The next, you're beyond the wall with Jon Snow. Then you're in Essos with Daenerys building her army. This structure creates a sense of epic scope but also emotional distance. We're observing from above, watching these pieces move across the board, understanding how everything connects but never staying with any one character long enough to get deeply embedded in their immediate reality. House of the Dragon continues this tradition, though with a somewhat tighter focus on the Targaryen civil war. Tales of Dunk and Egg does something radically different. These stories are told almost entirely from Dunk's perspective. We see the world through his eyes, experience his confusion, share his moral dilemmas, feel his fear and hope. This creates an intimacy that's rare in epic fantasy. We're not watching history unfold from multiple angles, we're living through specific moments with one person. When Dunk walks into a tournament and doesn't know the social protocols, we feel his discomfort. When he makes a choice based on his simple but deeply held sense of right and wrong, we understand exactly why he does it. The narrative isn't concerned with showing us 10 different political angles on an event. It's showing us how one good-hearted but inexperienced knight navigates a world that's often hostile to people like him. Let's talk about what characters these stories focus on, because this gets to the heart of Martin's intent when he wrote them. Martin has explained that he created Tales of Dunk and Egg specifically in response to criticism that his main series focused too heavily on nobility and highborn characters while neglecting the perspectives of commoners and small folk. And he took that feedback seriously. Ser Duncan the Tall is the perfect vehicle for exploring Westeros from the ground level. He's from Flea Bottom, the poorest slum in King's Landing. He's an orphan who never knew his parents. He was trained by a wandering hedge knight, not in some great castle with a master at arms. He has no lands, no wealth, no powerful family connections. When he attends tournaments, he has to sell one of his horses just to afford proper armor. He's often mistaken for a stable hand because people can't believe someone so common could be a knight. This perspective is revolutionary for Martin's world. Game of Thrones certainly has characters from humble origins, Davos Seaworth, Bronn, even Jon Snow in his own way, but the narrative always centers on those with power or those fighting for power. Even when we see commoners, we're usually seeing them through the eyes of nobles or in the context of how noble decisions affect them. With Dunk, we're finally experiencing Westeros as most people actually live in it, struggling to find work, dealing with petty local lords, trying to survive without the cushion of wealth and status. And this isn't a grim, miserable portrayal. Dunk's perspective actually brings more humor and warmth to the world because he's not weighed down by the cynicism that comes with power. Now, let's address one of the most striking tonal differences: the presence and nature of humor in these stories. Game of Thrones certainly has funny moments. Tyrion's wit, the banter between characters, occasional moments of levity. But the humor is almost always dark, sardonic, or cynical. It's the humor of people who've seen too much and cope through mockery or detachment. And it's used sparingly because the show's tone is relentlessly serious and grim. The world is brutal, trust is foolish, and nearly everyone is either scheming or suffering. Tales of Dunk and Egg has genuine humor, the kind that comes from human awkwardness and misunderstanding rather than cruelty or cynicism. Dunk is tall and strong but not particularly eloquent or socially adept. He often says the wrong thing, misunderstands noble customs, or gets himself into ridiculous situations through sheer earnestness. There's humor in watching him try to navigate a world of politics and social niceties when he's fundamentally a straightforward person who just wants to do right. Egg, despite being a prince, is a witty, sharp-tongued kid who often provides comic relief through his observations about the absurdities he witnesses. Their dynamic has elements of buddy comedy, the well-meaning but somewhat dim protector and his clever young companion who often has to explain things to him. This doesn't undercut the serious themes, it humanizes them. We can laugh with these characters because they're not carrying the weight of impending doom every moment. They're allowed to be people, not just pieces in a tragic game. Let's talk about themes and what these stories are actually about at their core. Game of Thrones explores themes like the corrupting nature of power, the price of ambition, the complexity of justice versus mercy, the destructiveness of war, and the question of whether good people can survive in a ruthless world. These are heavy, often nihilistic themes. The show repeatedly demonstrates that honor gets you killed, that the ruthless survive while the good suffer, that power poisons even those with noble intentions. The world of Game of Thrones is fundamentally cynical about human nature and institutions. It asks whether civilization itself is sustainable when everyone is competing for dominance. Tales of Dunk and Egg explore something different entirely. Yes, there's political intrigue in the background. The Blackfire rebellions loom over the stories, and we know tragedy eventually comes for these characters. But the novellas are fundamentally interested in questions like, what does true knighthood mean? Can honor survive without wealth and status? How do we maintain our principles when the world makes it difficult? What's the value of friendship and loyalty? These aren't cynical explorations. Martin presents Dunk as someone whose idealism, while sometimes naive, is also genuinely admirable and effective. Dunk's simple but unwavering commitment to protecting the weak and keeping his word makes him stand out in a world where most knights have forgotten what those vows actually mean. The story suggests that maybe the problem isn't that honor and goodness can't survive, maybe it's that people with power have abandoned these values. This brings us to the question of morality and how these different stories handle ethical complexity. Game of Thrones is famous, maybe infamous, for its moral ambiguity. Characters we're supposed to root for do terrible things. Characters we despise occasionally show unexpected depth or do the right thing. The show constantly challenges our judgments, asking whether any action can be simply good or evil when context is complicated. Is Jaime Lannister a hero or a villain? Is Daenerys a liberator or a tyrant? The show deliberately refuses to give us easy answers, and by the end, many fans felt lost in the moral fog, unsure what the story was even trying to say. Tales of Dunk and Egg takes a different approach. There's still nuance, still complexity, but there's also a clearer moral center. Dunk knows the difference between right and wrong. When Prince Aerion Targaryen assaults a puppeteer because he didn't like her puppet show, Dunk doesn't hesitate, he punches a prince in the face to defend her. This isn't morally ambiguous. Aerion is a sadistic bully using his power to hurt someone helpless. Dunk is doing what knights are supposed to do, protect those who can't protect themselves. Yes, there are consequences. Dunk faces a trial that could cost him his life, but the story never suggests he was wrong to act. The complexity comes not from questioning whether defending the innocent is right, but from exploring how difficult it is to do right when you don't have power, wealth, or social standing. The stories ask how someone without advantages can maintain their integrity, not whether integrity itself matters. Let's discuss violence and how it's portrayed, because this is crucial to understanding the tonal difference. Game of Thrones is notorious for its graphic violence. Beheadings, burnings, torture, sexual violence, brutal deaths that linger on screen. The show uses violence to shock, to demonstrate consequences, to show that this world is harsh and unforgiving. No one is safe, and death comes suddenly and often horribly. The Red Wedding, Oberyn's death, the Sept explosion, these moments are designed to traumatize the audience, to make us feel the cost of this world's brutality. Violence in Game of Thrones is often sensationalized, turned into spectacle. Tales of Dunk and Egg certainly contains violence. There are trials by combat, melees, jousting accidents, and we know both Dunk and Egg eventually die in the tragedy at Summerhall. But the violence isn't sensationalized or gratuitous, it's treated seriously, as something with real weight and consequence, but not as constant spectacle. When the trial of 7 happens in the Hedge night, people die, including Prince Baelor Breakspear, a genuinely good man. But the focus isn't on shocking the audience with graphic deaths. It's on the meaning of those deaths, the tragedy of good people caught in situations where violence becomes unavoidable, the ripple effects on those who survive. Martin described the upcoming show as having danger and death as well, despite the different tone, but it's clearly not aiming for the relentless grimness of Game of Thrones. Violence exists in this world, but it doesn't define the world. Now we need to talk about cynicism versus idealism, because this might be the most fundamental tonal difference. Game of Thrones is deeply cynical about power, politics, and human nature. The characters who try to play by the rules, who value honor over advantage, mostly end up dead. Ned Stark's execution in Season 1 sets the tone. Being good doesn't protect you. In fact, goodness makes you vulnerable. The characters who survive and thrive are those willing to lie, manipulate, betray, and kill. The show suggests that maybe the problem isn't that people like Ned fail. Maybe it's that the system itself rewards the worst aspects of human nature. By the end, even characters we rooted for have become hardened, cynical, willing to do terrible things for what they believe is the greater good. Tales of Dunk and Egg allows for idealism. Dunk is idealistic in a way that Game of Thrones would typically mock. He believes knights should be noble, should protect the weak, should keep their oaths. He learned these ideas from his mentor Ser Arlan of Pennytree, a poor hedge knight who nevertheless embodied these values. And crucially, Dunk's idealism isn't consistently punished by the narrative. Yes, it gets him into trouble. His defense of Tencel leads to the trial where Baelor dies, but that death doesn't invalidate Dunk's choice. The story doesn't suggest Dunk should have walked away. Instead, it explores how even right choices can have tragic consequences while still affirming that making those choices matters. Dunk's simple, almost naive commitment to doing good actually earns him respect from people who matter, including eventually the Kingsguard itself. Let's examine the pacing and structure, because this significantly affects how we experience these stories. Game of Thrones moves at a breakneck pace, especially in later seasons. Multiple plot lines advance simultaneously, major events happen constantly, characters die regularly, and there's always a sense of urgency, of building towards something catastrophic. The show trains us to expect shock, to anticipate that any moment of peace will be shattered. This creates tremendous tension, but also exhaustion. There's rarely time to breathe, to sit with characters in quiet moments, to enjoy their company without waiting for the other shoe to drop. Tales of Dunk and Egg has a completely different rhythm. These are relatively short stories, novellas rather than massive novels, but they don't feel rushed. Martin takes time for Dunk to walk to a tournament, to talk with fellow travelers, to help someone with a mundane problem. There are extended passages of Dunk and Egg simply riding together, talking, with Egg explaining things about the world that Dunk doesn't know. These moments aren't filler, they're the point. The stories are about the journey, not just the destination. We get to spend time with these characters doing ordinary things, setting up camp, buying supplies, having meals. This creates a sense of actually living in Westeros rather than just witnessing its most dramatic moments. When violence or conflict does come, it feels more impactful because we've been lulled into a more peaceful state. The pacing says this is a world where most days are actually pretty normal, where most people aren't fighting for their lives every moment. Let's talk about class and social hierarchy, a theme both series address but from very different angles. Game of Thrones shows us the nobility, their games, their conflicts, their consequences. When we see the small folk, they're usually suffering because of noble conflicts, caught in the crossfire of the Game of Thrones. The show is interested in how the powerful affect the powerless, but it's usually from the powerful's perspective. We see the commoners flee from Robb Stark's army or starve during the siege of King's Landing or get massacred by the Lannisters, but their backdrop, their casualties, they're the human cost of political decisions made by those above them. Tales of Dunk and Egg flips this entirely. Now we're with someone who lives on the level of those commoners. Dunk has to worry about money for food, for lodging, for equipment. He experiences firsthand what it's like when nobles treat everyone beneath them as disposable. He sees how the system works from below, how knights sworn to protect people actually abuse them, how justice depends on your status rather than facts. And because Egg is secretly a prince traveling among common people, he also gets his education. He sees what his family's policies actually mean for regular people. He understands that the distance between a prince in a castle and a peasant in the field isn't just physical, it's experiential. This perspective makes the stories fundamentally more empathetic toward those without power. The narrative validates their struggles, their dignity, their worth in ways Game of Thrones rarely managed despite occasional attempts. Now let's address the political complexity, or perhaps more accurately, the lack thereof. Game of Thrones is incredibly politically complex. Multiple factions with competing claims, shifting alliances, betrayals and counter-betrayals, plots within plots. Understanding what's happening requires tracking dozens of characters, their motivations, their relationships, their histories. The political maneuvering is sophisticated, sometimes too sophisticated, to the point where motivations become opaque and actions feel driven by plot necessity rather than character logic. The show asks viewers to be amateur political scientists, constantly analyzing who benefits from what, who's playing whom, what the long game might be. Tales of Dunk and Egg keeps politics much simpler. Yes, the Blackfire rebellions are happening in the background, and the Mystery Knight directly involves uncovering a conspiracy. But we're not asked to understand complex, multi-sided conflicts. The politics that matter are local, immediate, and personal. A dispute over water rights between two houses, a tournament that might be cover for a rebellion. Simple questions like whether a hedge knight will be allowed to enter a tournament. The political elements serve the character story rather than overwhelming it. We don't need charts to track who's allied with whom or what their great-great-grandfather's claim to some castle was. The politics are comprehensible, human scale, tied to immediate problems that affect Dunk and Egg directly. This makes the stories more accessible, but also more focused. They're not trying to map out the entire political landscape of Westeros. They're showing us how politics affects two people trying to make their way in the world. Let's discuss prophecy and destiny, themes that Game of Thrones became increasingly obsessed with. Azor Ahai Reborn, the prince that was promised, visions in flames, three-eyed ravens, chosen ones meant to save the world. Game of Thrones built much of its later mythology around prophecy, around the idea that certain people were destined for greatness or tragedy, that forces beyond human understanding were shaping events. This gave the story a sense of cosmic importance, but also stripped away some agency from characters. Were they making choices or fulfilling prophecies? Tales of Dunk and Egg largely avoids this. Yes, we as readers know Egg will become King Aegon V, and we know Dunk will become Lord Commander of the King's Guard. We know their lives will end together at Summerhall in mysterious tragedy, but within the stories themselves, there's no sense of destiny, no prophecies guiding their actions. They're just two people making choices based on their values and circumstances. Dunk doesn't know he'll become one of the most famous knights in history. Egg doesn't expect to be king, he's the fourth son of a fourth son. Their actions aren't about fulfilling some grand design, they're about responding to immediate situations with integrity. This grounds the stories in human choice and consequence rather than cosmic fate. It suggests that maybe the greatest heroes aren't chosen ones guided by prophecy, but ordinary people who consistently choose to do right even when it's hard. Let's talk about hope, because this might be the single most important tonal difference. Game of Thrones, especially in its later seasons, is largely devoid of hope. Characters die, dreams are crushed, betrayal is constant, and even victory comes at devastating cost. The show's message seems to be that the world is harsh, that idealism is naive, that the best you can hope for is survival. The final season, whatever you think of its specific choices, ends with most of our heroes dead, exiled, or broken, and with a system that seems likely to produce the same conflicts again. It's not exactly uplifting. There's a weariness to Game of Thrones, a sense that all this suffering might not actually mean anything. Tales of Dunk and Egg allows for hope. Not blind, foolish hope, but the possibility that good people doing good things actually matters. Yes, we know tragedy is coming for these characters eventually, but in the moment, their story is hopeful. Dunk finds purpose and friendship. He makes a real difference in people's lives. His commitment to his ideals earns him genuine respect and advancement. Egg learns to be a better person, to understand the people he'll one day rule. Their friendship is deep and real, something beautiful in a harsh world. The story suggests that even if everything ends badly, the choices we make along the way, the connections we forge, the good we do, those things have intrinsic value. They matter even if they don't prevent eventual tragedy. This is a fundamentally more hopeful worldview than Game of Thrones offers. Now let's consider what this tonal shift means for the franchise moving forward. Game of Thrones defined a particular style of fantasy television. Dark, violent, morally complex, politically intricate, visually spectacular. House of the Dragon continued that template successfully. But there's a risk in making everything feel the same. If every show set in Westeros has the same grim tone, the same relentless violence, the same cynical worldview, the franchise becomes monotonous. It's all the same note played over and over. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms offers HBO a chance to demonstrate that Westeros can support different kinds of stories with different emotional textures. This diversification is actually smart business. Not everyone wants relentless grimness. Some viewers might be fatigued by Game of Thrones' darkness, but attracted to a more hopeful, character-driven story set in the same world. Families might watch together, something you couldn't really do with Game of Thrones. The lighter tone doesn't mean less sophisticated, it means different. It means exploring other aspects of this world, other human experiences. And if A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms succeeds, it proves that the franchise can be flexible, that Westeros is rich enough to support multiple storytelling approaches, that opens doors for future projects to try other tonal variations rather than endlessly repeating the Game of Thrones formula. Let's discuss the adaptation challenges this presents. Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon had certain advantages as adaptations. The source material's darkness, complexity and moral ambiguity translated naturally to prestige television. The shocking moments provided built-in water cooler conversation. The spectacle justified the budget. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms faces different challenges. The novellas are relatively short. The first is only about 30,000 words. There's less material to adapt, which means the show needs 6 episodes to cover what Game of Thrones might have done in 3. This requires slowing down, living in moments, exploring character rather than constantly advancing plot. That's creatively interesting but commercially risky. Modern audiences, especially those trained by Game of Thrones, expect constant momentum. Can a show succeed by being deliberately slower and quieter? The other challenge is the tonal shift itself. How do you market a show that's in the Game of Thrones universe but explicitly not like Game of Thrones? How do you set audience expectations so they don't show up wanting dragons and red weddings and instead appreciate what they're actually getting? The show needs to be comfortable being what it is rather than trying to shoehorn in Game of Thrones elements that don't fit. If it succeeds, it'll be by embracing its difference, not by apologizing for it. Let's look at what makes Tales of Dunk and Egg specifically appealing despite or perhaps because of its different tone. There's something deeply satisfying about stories where good people try to do good things and sometimes succeed. Not easily, not without cost, but succeed nonetheless. Dunk's story is refreshing precisely because he's not an anti-hero, not morally compromised, not cynical. He's earnest and genuine in a way that's rare in modern fantasy. That earnestness could be corny, but Martin makes it work because he grounds it in real struggle. Dunk isn't successful because he's perfect. He's barely trained as a knight. He's not particularly clever. He makes mistakes constantly, but he has one crucial quality. He genuinely cares about doing right, and he doesn't compromise on that even when it costs him. In an era where entertainment constantly tells us that moral clarity is naive, that everyone is corrupt, that the system is rigged, and participation makes you complicit, there's something powerful about a story that says, no, you can maintain your integrity, you can stand up for what's right, and that matters even if it's hard. The friendship between Dunk and Egg provides another kind of appeal. It's warm, genuine, built on mutual respect despite their very different backgrounds. Egg could use his royal status to command Dunk, but he doesn't. Dunk could resent Egg's privilege, but he doesn't. They genuinely like each other, learn from each other, make each other better. That kind of uncomplicated positive relationship is rare in grimdark fantasy. Let's talk about the historical period these stories inhabit and how that shapes the tone. Tales of Dunk and Egg is set during the reign of the Targaryen kings, Daeron II and Aerys I, followed by Maekar Wars, a period Martin has described as relatively stable, at least compared to the chaos of Game of Thrones. The dragons are gone, having died out about a century earlier. This is a world that's lost its magic, become more mundane, more realistic. Without dragons as weapons of mass destruction, conflicts are smaller scale. Without prophecy and visions driving royal policy, politics are more grounded. This isn't the age of heroes or the age of apocalypse, it's the age of normal governance, of routine problems, of life continuing. This historical context naturally creates a different tone. The stakes are lower because the tools of mass destruction are unavailable. The Blackfire rebellions, while significant, are succession disputes rather than existential threats. Life goes on in most of Westeros regardless of who wins. For Dunk and Egg specifically, they're living in history's footnotes, the periods between the major events. They're not stopping apocalypses or conquering continents, they're just living, and that's the point. Their lives matter not because of grand historical importance, but because they're human lives worthy of attention and care regardless of political significance. We should consider the influence of genre conventions here. Game of Thrones helped popularize what's called grimdark fantasy, a subgenre characterized by moral ambiguity, graphic violence, cynical worldviews, and the subversion of traditional fantasy tropes. It said fantasy doesn't have to be about noble heroes defeating evil, it can be about complicated people doing terrible things for understandable reasons. This was revolutionary when A Game of Thrones, the novel, was published in 1996 and it remains influential. But grimdark has become its own set of conventions, its own cliches, the edgy anti-hero, the graphic violence, the anyone can die mentality, these are now expected rather than surprising. Tales of Dunk and Egg, written starting in 1998, represents Martin exploring a different set of fantasy traditions. These stories look back to older forms of fantasy, stories about knights errant having adventures, protecting the innocent, facing challenges that test their honor. Think Don Quixote, Arthurian romance, classic adventure fantasy. But Martin isn't just replicating those older forms, he's bringing his realistic eye to them, asking what chivalric idealism would actually look like in a complex, morally ambiguous world. The result is something that feels both fresh and classic, modern in its realism, but traditional in its heart. It proves that Martin isn't just a grimdark guy. He can work in multiple registers, explore different emotional territories. Let's address the question of whether Dunk and Egg is better than Game of Thrones, a question that misses the point entirely. They're trying to do different things. Game of Thrones wants to be epic, tragic, politically complex, morally challenging. It wants to make you think hard about power, question your assumptions, shock you out of complacency. Tales of Dunk and Egg wants to be intimate, human, character-driven, morally grounded while still complex. It wants you to care deeply about these two people, to root for them, to find hope in their friendship and decency. Neither approach is inherently superior. They serve different purposes, satisfy different needs, appeal to different aspects of human experience. Sometimes you want the grand tragedy, the political intrigue, the epic scope. Sometimes you want the small-scale adventure, the uncomplicated friendship, the affirmation that goodness exists and matters. The real question isn't which is better, but whether a Knight of the Seven Kingdoms will successfully execute its vision. Will it embrace its differences or try to be Game of Thrones light? Will it trust that audiences can appreciate a quieter, more hopeful story? Will it honor the spirit of the novellas or feel the need to darken and complicate them to match franchise expectations? That's what we should be watching for. One fascinating aspect is how this tonal difference reflects on the characters themselves. In Game of Thrones, nearly everyone is traumatized, carrying wounds that shape their actions. Trauma is central to understanding character motivation. The Stark children are defined by their father's execution and their subsequent suffering. Theon becomes Reek. Sansa's innocence is brutally stripped away. Arya becomes a killer. Trauma begets more trauma in cycles that seem endless. In Tales of Dunk and Egg, while characters certainly experience hardship, they're not defined by trauma. Dunk is an orphan from terrible poverty, but he's not bitter or broken. He carries his mentor's lessons about knighthood as something positive, not as naivety to be crushed. Egg is a prince living in disguise, separated from his family, but he's not damaged by this. Instead, it's educational, broadening his perspective. Their experiences shape them, but don't break them. They maintain capacity for joy, for humor, for forming healthy relationships. This reflects a fundamentally different view of human resilience. Game of Thrones suggests trauma is nearly inescapable, that it fundamentally rewrites who you are, usually for the worse. Tales of Dunk and Egg suggest that people can endure hardship and remain fundamentally decent, that positive influences, like Ser Arlan's teaching for Dunk or Dunk's example for Egg, can be as powerful as negative ones. This is more optimistic about human nature's ability to resist corruption. Let's consider the role of mentorship, a theme handled very differently between the series. Game of Thrones features complicated mentor-student relationships, Ned and his children, Tyrion and Podrick, the Hound and Arya, Barristan and Daenerys. These relationships are often fraught, complicated by ulterior motives, or end badly. The lessons learned are often about survival, manipulation, the harsh realities of power, even when mentors genuinely care about their students. Like Ned for his children, the mentorship often leads to suffering when students try to apply noble principles in an ignoble world. Tales of Dunk and Egg places mentorship at its absolute center. Ser Arlan's teaching of Dunk, though we never meet Arlan, reverberates through every story. Arlan taught Dunk that knights should protect the weak, keep their oaths, live by honor. These aren't presented as foolish lessons that get Dunk killed. They're the foundation of his character and success. Then Dunk becomes mentor to Egg, not teaching him swordsmanship primarily, but showing him through example how to live with integrity, how to see and value common people, how to make hard choices based on principle rather than advantage. This mentorship isn't about learning to survive in a cruel world, it's about learning to be a good person in a complicated one. The story suggests mentorship is how values perpetuate, how one generation's goodness can shape the next. That's fundamentally hopeful in a way Game of Thrones rarely manages. We need to talk about stakes and how different types of stakes create different tones. Game of Thrones operates with existential stakes. The White Walkers threaten all human life. The wars for the Iron Throne kill thousands and destroy entire regions. Individual character stakes are life and death, constantly. This creates tremendous tension, but also a kind of exhaustion. Everything always matters enormously. Every scene could end in death. The constant high stakes become numbing after a while, and paradoxically, deaths start to lose impact because we expect them. Tales of Dunk and Egg has lower stakes in absolute terms. The conflicts are personal, local, affecting dozens or hundreds rather than thousands. But because we're so invested in these specific characters, because the pacing gives us time to care, the stakes feel significant despite being smaller. When Dunk faces the trial of 7, he could die, and that matters to us not because his death would change history, but because we've come to care about him as a person. The threat isn't to the world, it's to this one decent man who is just trying to do the right thing. These personal stakes can actually feel more emotionally engaging than abstract threats to humanity because they're more concrete, more relatable. Most of us will never face a White Walker army, but most of us have faced situations where doing the right thing could cost us significantly. We understand Dunk's dilemma viscerally in ways we can't quite grasp the political maneuvering for the Iron Throne. Let's discuss narrative reward, what these different stories offer as payoff for investment. Game of Thrones offers spectacle, shocking moments, the satisfaction of seeing complex plots resolve, though whether the resolution was satisfying is debatable. The reward for sticking with Game of Thrones through its darker moments is supposed to be the epic conclusion, the resolution of mysteries, the final disposition of characters we followed. In practice, many fans felt the ending didn't justify the journey, that the payoff was insufficient for the investment. Tales of Dunk and Egg offers different rewards. The pleasure is in the journey itself, in spending time with these characters, in experiencing their friendship, in seeing Dunk consistently choose honor even when it's hard, in watching Egg learn and grow. The stories are short enough that the journey is the payoff. You're not enduring darkness waiting for a redemptive ending. You're enjoying the experience of being with these characters. And because we know from history that Dunk becomes Lord Commander and Egg becomes King, there's satisfaction in seeing the seeds of their future success. We're watching the formation of legends in their humble beginnings. The tragedy of Summerhall hangs over everything for readers who know the larger history, adding poignancy. But within the stories themselves, there's affirmation that their choices matter, that their lives have meaning, that goodness can advance even in an imperfect world. Finally, let's think about what this means for fantasy storytelling more broadly. Game of Thrones proved that fantasy could be adult, complex, politically sophisticated, free of the genre's sillier conventions. It opened doors, changed perceptions, made fantasy respectable to audiences who'd previously dismissed it. That's genuinely important, but it also created a template that subsequent fantasy has often felt obligated to follow. Everything needs to be dark, morally gray, subversive, willing to kill beloved characters. The success of grimdark has been so complete that lighter, more hopeful fantasy sometimes struggles to find audiences. It's seen as juvenile, unsophisticated for kids. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms represents an opportunity to demonstrate that maturity in fantasy doesn't require unrelenting grimness. You can tell sophisticated, adult stories that acknowledge complexity and moral difficulty while still allowing for honor, friendship, hope, and moral clarity. You can have stakes and tension without constant death. You can treat violence seriously without making it spectacle. You can explore political and social themes without making everything cynical. If A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms succeeds on its own terms, it could help expand what audiences expect from fantasy, creating space for different tonal approaches rather than just endless grimdark imitators. The genre is healthier when it can support multiple voices, multiple approaches, multiple emotional registers. So where does this leave us as we wait for A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms to premiere? We should approach it with open minds, ready to experience something different from what we've come to expect from Westeros on screen. This isn't Game of Thrones Season 9 or House of the Dragon with the knights instead of dragons. It's its own thing, with its own tone, its own pace, its own priorities. Success means honoring the spirit of Martin's novellas, the warmth, the humor, the human scale, the moral clarity within complexity, the emphasis on character over spectacle. It means trusting that audiences can appreciate a quieter, more hopeful story without needing to juice it up with Game of Thrones elements. It means showing us that Westeros is big enough for different kinds of stories, that the same world can support both epic tragedy and intimate adventure. George R.R. Martin created something special in Tales of Dunk and Egg, stories that balance realism with idealism, complexity with clarity, darkness with hope. If HBO can translate that balance to screen, we're in for something genuinely refreshing. Not a rejection of what came before, but an expansion of what this universe can be. And honestly, after years of unrelenting grimness, don't we deserve to spend time with a giant knight who just wants to do good in the world and his clever young friend learning what kind of king he wants to become? I think we do. That's it for this video. Let me know in the comments what you're most looking forward to in A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, or whether you prefer the darker tone of Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon. Do you think audiences are ready for a more hopeful take on Westeros, or will the tonal shift turn people off? And if you enjoyed this deep dive into Martin's different storytelling approaches, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more analysis of the world of Ice and Fire. Until next time, stay true to your oaths and protect those who can't protect themselves, just like Dunk would want. Thanks for watching.